Trial of Walter Raleigh was a real event. He was a brilliant legal defender. He defended himself on the stand to sort of track the last years of Elizabeth, Raleigh's imprisonment, and this huge celebrity trial that took place in 1604. That's the subject of a great movie.
The Virgin Queen brings together a great disparate group of creative minds. First and foremost amongst those is Charles Brackett. Charles Brackett, incredibly famous writer in Hollywood history. He had written a diverse group of scripts, probably most famously known for having written the script for Sunset Boulevard. He wrote the great 20th Century Fox color noir film Niagara with Marilyn Monroe. He had adapted P.G. Wodehouse to the screen, and he was a storyteller. And if anybody can lay the blame at anyone's feet for having twisted the history of England to tell a good story, Charles Brackett would have been first in line to take the blame for this. Charles Brackett did not write The Virgin Queen. For that, he hired a writer named Mildred Lord because he was far too busy at the time. He was producing a number of films. A lot of producing assignments had come in after the success of Niagara. He was someone that Darryl F. Zanuck could trust with some of the large budget pictures. There was a huge transition within the studio over to CinemaScope, and he knew that Brackett understood the ins and outs of production to make sure one of those productions ran smoothly. Mildred was credited as Mildred Lord most of the time, which made many people believe that a woman wrote the screenplay. This was not the case. Originally, the short story that this was based on was called Sir Walter Raleigh. One of the reasons that the film was entitled The Virgin Queen rather than Sir Walter Raleigh was the problem of how do you pronounce the name Sir Walter Raleigh. Americans tend to pronounce it Sir Walter Raleigh, like the city in North Carolina. British tend to say Raleigh. It's a slightly different pronunciation. British cast members said it one way, American cast members say it another. In the film, they had to decide how it was going to be pronounced. They chose the British pronunciation.
Your name and business?
Captain Walter Raleigh, ma'am. You come from Ireland.
But for publicizing the film, in the trailers, you hear Sir Walter Raleigh.
I think the movie would have been quite different if the title of the film had been Sir Walter Raleigh. I think Walter Raleigh really is a figure that's worthy of his own movie, of a tale of his own life, which was rich and diverse and interesting. I actually think that Richard Todd does a brilliant job with Walter Raleigh, playing the supporting role.
And Richard Todd was really being groomed to be a young, masculine, adventurous star for 20th Century Fox. So it was, of course, quite a twist that where he had the title role in the previous film, A Man Called Peter, he was to hold the title role in Sir Walter Raleigh. When it was retitled The Virgin Queen, of course, that had been sort of taken from him. And he was never able to sort of truly regain that star status that they had hoped for. You put him on screen with somebody like Bette Davis, and Bette Davis's performance was really able to outshine him in a lot of respects.
For me, Bette Davis was an absolute force of nature. I mean, you could not, no matter what kind of role you put her in, you could not keep her kind of within boundaries. She was just so extraordinary.
The film was produced entirely in the United States, of course, in Southern California. None of the film was shot in England. The biggest production challenges during the film happened to deal with the production design, costuming, all of the elaborate costume drama trappings that you wanted.
The clothes are very much a 1950s take on what a woman would be wearing in the 16th century.
And I do know that, for example, she would talk about that role, the Virgin Queen, and also when she played Elizabeth before. And I know in one of the roles, in any event, in both roles, she had to wear these big dresses, and it was very hot. And I think she had to shave her eyebrows totally off. And so these are kind of like the details of actors and actresses that you don't really hear about, that she would say at home, like, I can't believe I did that, and that was really hard to do. And
Bette Davis, when she became attached to the picture, and which was really supposed to be a film about Sir Walter Raleigh, and in a lot of ways it is, but it's her performance that absolutely captures the viewer.
It takes strategy to reach me.
I have already used much strategy.
On whom?
The Earl of Leicester, for one.
Then you are a soldier indeed.
There are many other notable performances in the film. It is Joan Collins' first film that she makes in the United States. She'd done a little bit of work in England before this. She was brought out to Hollywood, and this was her chance to shine. And she really took Hollywood by storm, became a famed contract player for 20th Century Fox. And this film really helped launch her.
Joan Collins' performance of Bess Throckmorton in this film was one of the great and delightful surprises to me of the movie. The way that she delivered her lines, the speed at which she gave her lines back.
You pursued very fast.
On the contrary, Captain, I do not pursue, I surround. A good night to you.
Joan Collins did a marvelous job at showing what it took to survive as a woman at the court of Elizabeth. You had to have your wits about you.
And it's notable that when you have Bette Davis, a woman who's in her 40s, who's playing the Queen of England in this film, and you have Joan Collins, who's playing the young romantic interest, it's not Joan Collins who steals the film. It is Bette Davis who steals the film.
You come to plead your husband's life?
20th Century Fox decided that they were going to go widescreen with films that would be too big to fit on a television screen. And they took an old anamorphic process called anamorphoscope, and they adapted it into cinemascope. They patented this process, and they licensed it out to other studios. And it was a process that survived well into the 1960s. 20th Century Fox's initial production in cinemascope was How to Marry a Millionaire. But that's not the first one they released. The first one they released was Henry Koster's production, The Robe. And the reason they did this is because they wanted a big family film people would feel like they really wanted to go see, a film that could really show off the cinemascope process. This, of course, is a film with deep Christian religious themes. Koster himself, of course, was Jewish. Darryl F. Zanuck felt that Henry Koster had captured the potential of cinemascope. Many directors were flummoxed by having to frame for the new widescreen process. So Koster became the go-to director for 20th Century Fox when they had a large-scale, expensive production that they wanted to do in the widescreen process of cinemascope. Koster's importance as a director is as someone who could take large-scale technical projects and still bring a human face to them. He was known as a very workmanlike director, but there's always something within his films that deals with almost a sort of duality of identities.
He wasn't the type of director who would direct very deep, somber, reflective movies like Bergman or somebody like that. He always said that when someone went to see one of his films, he wanted them to come out feeling better than when they went in.
He was a Jewish immigrant from Germany who had fled Germany at the beginning of the Nazi era. Like a number of German immigrants came to the United States.
He was born in 1905, and he remained in Berlin until Hitler came to power.
When he went to school and he was 12 or 13 years old, the teacher went around the class and asked everybody what they wanted to be. Dad said he wanted to be a director in Hollywood.
His parents divorced when he was quite young, so he was mainly raised by his mother. His father was too much out of the picture and could no longer be relied upon to provide regular support. So he had to support himself and his mother from the time he was 15 years old on.
He grew up in a time which was very, very difficult.
When he was in Germany, he was poor, and he remembered being hungry during World War I, and he remembered passing out in school from hunger. And
so Dad's primary interest was not art or music or anything. It was making money. And he found that he could make money by writing short stories. He was always a writer. And he wrote short stories that were just marvelous and were very adaptable. And the movie studios felt the same way, and they would hire him to write scenarios. And he would write scenarios like that for famous movie stars. And he became the head sort of director's assistant to a director by the name of Curtis Bernhardt. And Dad became his main assistant. And one day, on a movie that Bernhardt was directing, Bernhardt got ill and called Dad and said, "I can't come in today, you direct." And Dad started directing.
He started becoming successful with some of the Berlin movie studios and started making very good money. And at the time that Hitler came to power, he was already a well-established director in Berlin.
Koster's direction of The Virgin Queen is a fascinating story. It's about a man who wants to leave his home country, who is in conflict with the ruling class of that country. And this, of course, was a story that was very similar to Koster himself, having to leave Germany, who had worked within the system and ultimately had to make peace with departing because the system had changed into one that was untenable for him.
Dad knew he had to leave because already extras were yelling at him, "You Jew, you when Hitler takes over, you won't tell anybody what to do anymore," and so forth.
Only 3 days after Hitler was elected, my father went into his bank to withdraw some money, and suddenly he noticed that behind the teller windows where he would normally go to get his money, that not only were the tellers there, but there were Nazi officers with swastikas on their armbands standing behind the tellers, kind of supervising them.
He tried to get his savings out so he could leave the country, and the teller, who the day before had been a friend of his, was now wearing an SA uniform. And now he didn't recognize Dad. Now Dad was a Jew. Dad said, "I want to take my money out." The teller said, "You don't have any money anymore." And Dad said, "Yes, I do." And he took out his passbook, and the teller, without looking at it, ripped it up and threw it on the floor. Dad said, "I want to see the manager." And the teller said, "Mr. Schmidt isn't here." Dad said, "I'll wait for him." He sat down, and the teller picked up the telephone
right in front of my father and dialed an extension and said, "There's a Herr Kosterlitz here who wants to withdraw some money. What should I tell him?"
He said, "Okay, I'll tell him." And he hung up and he said, "Mr. Schmidt isn't here."
So my father said to him, "Well, I just heard you talking to somebody. What do you mean there's nobody there?"
And the teller said, "You Jew bastard." He said, "You're calling me a liar?"
And my father got so angry at that he literally launched himself across the teller window and went for the throat.
This SS guard was lying on the floor, and Mr. Schmidt came. And Mr. Schmidt pulled Dad off the teller and took him out the front door of the bank and got his own wallet, opened his wallet and got some money out and handed it to Dad and said, "You go to the railroad station right now and leave the country.
You have to get out of Germany right away. You're in big trouble. Don't even go home to your apartment.
Don't go back to work. Don't go home and pack. Go to the railroad station and take the first train out of the country. Get out of here. You'll be killed if you don't do that." And Dad went to the railroad station. He got on the train and he went to Paris. And 45 minutes later, he was out of the country.
As someone who fled from Nazi Germany, he would have had a very interesting take on the reign of Elizabeth.
He was a man without a country for 3 years. He traveled around Europe. He wrote in Paris and he directed in Budapest and Vienna and Amsterdam. And then he and his partner, Joe Pasternak, who was a producer, traveled to the United States in February of 1936. And he restarted his career in the United States. When he came back from Europe, apparently the best offer he got was from 20th Century Fox, from Darryl F. Zanuck. And Zanuck sort of left him alone and let him do, or assigned him pictures that he was comfortable with. I don't think he ever realized how good a director he was.
Henry Koster, during the course of production, broke his arm and would joke that the cast on his arm was easier to deal with than the cast he was having to direct.
I think we always look at films, and as historians we want to determine how accurate is it. And there are certainly places in the film where there's some license taken with what actually happened. But I think it's equally important to look at the overall impression that it gives you of the period. The language that's used really sounds right. There's a cadence and a lilt and a formality to the speech that really, I think, is in keeping with the prose and the poetry of that age. So as I listened to it, it was really easy for me to get caught up in the language of Elizabethan England, which is the language of Shakespeare, and it's the language that we still speak today.
And you, are you half hawk and half vulture?
I soar high, but I eat no carrion.
Ah, the hawk is a pointed tongue. Did you hear that, Christopher?
Aye, ma'am, clearly. Hawks have loud and raucous voices.
Would you mellow mine, sir?
La, smooth your feathers, Captain. We are all hawks here.
Elizabeth I is one of the most consummate actresses of all time. She's the monarch who said, "We princes are on stages for all the world to view." She saw her job as part acting, and she was a very skillful actress, as scenes in this movie show. There's a wonderful scene when the French ambassador comes to her bedside and she is playing at being sick because she wants to get rid of him. In fact, this is something Elizabeth did all through her life. When her sister tried to get her in jail, Elizabeth said, "I can't go to prison, I'm too ill to travel." Whenever someone pressed her too much on marriage, she would say, "I can't talk to you right now, I don't feel well." So there's a wonderful way that Bette Davis captures the sort of peevish, manipulative side of Elizabeth, as well as the side that would just look someone straight in the eye and give it to them if they deserved it. She doesn't shy away from those kinds of contradictions. So I think Bette Davis's insights into the challenges of an aging female actress had a really direct relevance to the challenges facing an aging female monarch.
The Virgin Queen is a notable film first and foremost because of the performance by Bette Davis. Bette Davis was the perfect actress to play Queen Elizabeth. She, more than any other actress, really embodied the sense of a woman who had all the power in the world and still could not actually get what she wanted. And that internal conflict she was able to bring to life like no actress before or since. And she could do that in such an amazingly restrained yet powerful way that it really brings this film to life.
You know, she was a girl from New England. She was hardworking. She had to earn everything that she got. She was tremendously talented, but I think she had to break her way in to the film industry, which she got by a number of lucky circumstances, which a lot of people get. But when she got there, she worked hard to stay there.
In 1952, Bette Davis had surgery. She had not done a film since 1952, and so she came back to do The Virgin Queen after a fairly long absence.
Bette Davis is about the right age to play Elizabeth at this point in her life.
Bette Davis made it very clear when she came to do this film that she wanted to continue acting in Hollywood despite her age, despite the shortage of roles for women in her age bracket.
In the period of this movie, no one thinks Elizabeth's going to have any children. After 40, most people felt she was well beyond the age of childbirth. And I think Bette Davis is very sensitive about playing the multiple challenges that face a woman who's past the age of childbearing, who occupies a position of power, and who can't fully trust the people who are around her.
It was a problem for her as she became older, as it is for actors and actresses now. As you become older, the parts aren't there. So she was always looking for good scripts, and she was always upset that she couldn't get good scripts. And she wanted to perform all the time. If she had her druthers, she would be working every day, all year long.
She was reprising her role as Queen Elizabeth. She had famously starred in Elizabeth and Essex in 1939, where she co-starred with Olivia de Havilland, who she would later go on to co-star with in Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte.
I'm struck by the ways in which Bette Davis seems to feel that the only way she can really portray the power of Elizabeth is to capitalize on Elizabeth's masculine side. So we see Bette Davis with a very masculine walk, with an almost kind of bawdy style of speech. When in reality, what's so fascinating about Elizabeth is that she blended masculine and feminine power very skillfully. She liked being the object of men's affections. She liked being cast as the damsel in distress, as long as it only went so far.
She would be a great monarch. She was always the leader. She was the leader of our family. she didn't let anybody else lead because it was her way. That, you know, the way she wanted to do it. My mother she was a star, and she was a star with her fans, and she was a star at home, a different type of a star. But you know, she was the one who set the tone.
Elizabeth I is one of the most enigmatic women in history. She never wanted anybody to forget she was the one with the power, and she could yell. She had a short temper.
Open the door! Raleigh! You were not called here, you came here. And out at elbows dissembling rogue, foul from the Irish wars. And I took pity on you and allowed you to serve me.
You know, my mother was a tough woman, and she could be very volatile.
Bette Davis was noted as being a very strong-willed actress, a woman who would let everyone know what she wanted and work very hard to get it.
It was her way or the highway at times. At other times, she was very sensitive and loving and caring, but you weren't really sure what you were going to get and when you were going to get it.
The fact that Elizabeth was someone who was not afraid to be seen as someone powerful and someone who was strong, and that Bette Davis doesn't believe that being strong means that you can't be vulnerable. The way Bette Davis approaches Elizabeth, I think, is strategically. I think she sees the strategy, some would say manipulation, that Elizabeth brought to her relationships with other people, her relationships with other nations. So she had that masculine side to her. She could hunt, she could shoot a bow and arrow, she could ride like the wind, but she also could dance. She was very vain about her appearance. She wanted to be the object of male affection.
Oh, Walter, I am hot and out of sorts. As you love me, speak only gentle words, and I will do the same.
Aye, ma'am.
Bette Davis really threw herself into this part. She wanted this performance to live up to and exceed the performance she had given as Queen Elizabeth in 1939. She had her head partially shaved, which is very clearly visible. Anything that she needed to do to make the role true, vanity went out the window.
The thing about her, though, that I admired the most is that she was not afraid to play unsympathetic characters. At a time when most of the big star actresses would never touch a part where the woman was an evil figure, those were Bette Davis's meat. I mean, she was smart enough to realize that those are often, the villainous roles are often the very best roles.
She appeared in 7 decades of films and made over 120 films, and even if you were from another planet, you would recognize that she was a superstar and the greatest female actress of all time.
The American cinema would be a lesser thing indeed without the contributions of Bette Davis.
Sir Walter Raleigh is well known to historians as being a man who may have done great heroic deeds, but he also certainly had an element of a con man to him. This was an aspect of Sir Walter Raleigh's character that was apparent in everything that he did.
If he had lived under any other monarch, I think we would remember him more than we do today. I think one of the difficulties in living in the court of Elizabeth is Elizabeth overshadowed everybody. She's the one we focus on. She's the brightest light.
I implore you, no sword play with Christopher. On your oath.
It shall be as you say, ma'am. On my oath.
That's better. And do not make me bandy words, so I am not well.
I think Richard Todd does a brilliant job with Walter Raleigh, and I think part of it is because he manages to capture the frustration that young, ambitious men could feel at the court of Elizabeth. They were raised in a culture that gave men a patriarchal advantage in the world, and yet they were expected to dance in attendance on an aging female monarch. For a very ambitious man, a man like Raleigh, who the Queen adored, This was a difficult line to walk. I think that Richard Todd's experiences in World War II, living in a country that was really hard hit by war, but also playing war heroes on film, really helps him to bring that element into his portrayal of Raleigh. Raleigh was a military hero.
Todd himself was considered very much of a man's man. You can see this in the swashbuckling sword fighting scene early on.
The sword fighting in this movie, I think Richard Todd really knows and understands combat. He understands combat both in the verbal sense, these wonderful sparring matches that he gets in with Bess Throckmorton, the sparring he does with Elizabeth, but also the fighting with the sword. I do think that he understands the nature of combat, be it military or verbal.
The passion that he's able to give to this, his sense of movement, his sense of rhythm, and he gives a very credible performance. Koster and Richard Todd would go on to work together again in D-Day, the 6th of June, 20th Century Fox's 1950s attempt to tell the story of the D-Day invasion, a film that would largely be overshadowed when Darryl F. Zanuck went and produced The Longest Day in the early 1960s.
Well, if you too have troubles, drink them away with this.
Ah, thank you, Captain Bach. I will find troubles I did not know I had.
It appears as though Sir Walter Raleigh has achieved a grand victory by being allowed to have ships from Queen Elizabeth to sail on his great adventures.
The picture gives you the sense of Raleigh's life coming to a complete and fulfilling end at the moment he is granted his ships and can go to the New World. In reality, Raleigh has a very difficult time at court under both Elizabeth I and also under her successor, James I. And he is charged with treason. He's imprisoned multiple times. Ultimately, Raleigh ends his life as a prisoner. He is executed, and he's executed in connection with plots made not against Elizabeth, but made against her successor, James I. So Raleigh's life is not the perfect happy ending that we see when the music swells up and the sails fill and the ship leaves the Thames for the New World.
Think to pleasure me with such a sight?
I think that Elizabeth I is remarkable in the way that she seems to reach across the centuries and speak to people who are living in a very different time and in a very different place. The filmmakers really should be applauded for capturing what they were able to capture through words and through the look of the film. They were able to capture some of the real essence of the age in the way that they shot it, the way that the sets were designed, and the way that the dialogue for the script was written.
2 months have passed and 7 are yet to run. A puking winch and some waves. I must go on with the business of state.